Hey there everyone, and welcome to Corey Loses for a video I've been waiting to make for a while. So as you can tell from the title, there has been a new official patch released for Empire at War Forces of Corruption on the Steam build. So this again just applies to the Steam build, much like the previous patches do, not to GOG Disc or Origin, unfortunately. But Petroglyph had a few weeks between other projects that they were doing, the developers of Empire at War, and they wanted to use that time to make some updates to the game. So I really want to thank Petroglyph and Disney for doing this and releasing this, because there is a lot, I am very excited about this. So thank you very much to Petroglyph specifically, Ted, Steve, and Brian, who I believe did a lot of the heavy lifting here. I don't know if there were others involved, but yeah, this is really exciting. So they contacted a bunch of modders beforehand, got a lot of feedback on problems we thought existed with the game, and there are some fixes that impact primarily just the released game as players would experience it, but there's also a lot that really opens up some possibilities with modding here. We're going to talk about the things the patch does, but we're also going to talk a little bit on stuff that it will mean for Empire or Expanded in particular. So some of the first player-facing updates are the inclusion of some extra maps for multiplayer. This was done with the cooperation of the Empire at War community Discord, where there were 2 maps that were re-added to Forces of Corruption, and then 5 multiplayer maps re-added to Empire at War that were never in the Steam version of the game. These are maps based on Utapau and Dathomir for Forces of Corruption, and then the Polis Winds, Peril Above Polis, Shipyards of Kuat, Race for Ryloth, and Ryloth Garrison multiplayer maps for Empire at War. They also fixed some behavior in Forces of Corruption where Han Solo and Slave 1, which is basically the fighter-ish heroes, would end up in dogfights behaving similar ways to other fighters, when if you look in base Empire at War before Forces of Corruption, they actually behave very differently, and it really does impact their effectiveness, so that has been fixed. But let's get to the changes that have a bigger impact on the mods typically. So there were 2 smaller fixes that we'll talk about first. One is that the overflow on the reinforcement pool is gone. So if you've watched any of my playthroughs where towards the end, especially with patron units, I'll start to have little hero faces appearing all over the screen, that no longer happens. So you can safely put all your units together in a single fleet and not have to worry about breaking the UI. Another thing they've done is double the capacity of the build bars in land and space, or galactic and tactical levels. So modders need to activate these extra slots themselves, but this is something that we were never able to do before, is add extra slots. So now, even though we are probably going to still use filters for a lot of things, there's a lot more flexibility there, and that should really help a lot with things like instant action in particular, but also on the galactic level. And now we've got the 4 changes that I think are going to really change what mods are able to do. First off is something a little bit more obvious in its impact, is that you are now able to detect special structures in space through the AI. So the AI is able to know when they're attacking a planet that has Golans in place. This is something that they were never able to do before. So if you had your main station, the AI could see that. But if you start coding in secondary defenses like Golan platforms like we had in Thrawn's Revenge and other mods like AOTR had, or Phoenix Rising, then the AI wouldn't know they're there, and they wouldn't be able to attack them properly. We tried a few different workarounds for this, but they were usually not fantastic. There was some, on our side, we had the main starbase be a combat power dummy that the AI can see, so they know roughly how strong thing is. AOTR had a version where there were unit dummies, and there were pluses and minuses to both of these, but now they're not necessary anymore. The AI can just see them natively, and it should work out perfectly fine that way. So we're able to do a lot more with defensive structures that way. The next change is that we're able to use OR operators for required special structures. So in Empire at War, you are able to set a bunch of structures as a requirement to build a unit, and you need all of them, but there was no way to have different criteria without having a completely different unit. But now you're able to set different possibilities, which means for us, for example, influence rewards, which before had to be all at level 10 because it was based on a structure, we are able to have that be level 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. And this is especially useful because we're able to now take away a lot of the spawning we do on the galactic level for filters, because we used to have to spawn a bunch of stuff for the AI to make sure they'd have all the requirements. But now we can almost remove every single requirement or every single building we're spawning for the AI, which should make it a lot smoother on the galactic level. Now, this isn't necessarily the biggest drain on performance, but it should have a noticeable impact, along with other directly gameplay related things we can do with that. So I was kind of grouping those together. There's still 3 more. I guess I could have just said there were 5 major things. However you want to classify it, the next one is that they have fixed an issue where if you have more than 21 factions coded in, the game will crash. And if you have more than 16 factions coded in, if you invade the factions in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, or 21st slot, the game will crash. Now, for Thrawn's Revenge in particular, this has a few obvious implications. It means that, for one thing, we are no longer cutting the Arido Authority, and it also means we're able to break up the independent forces into some various factions like the Avitha, who should be coming back as well as a playable faction, and the Mandalorians, and some other examples that will no longer just be part of a mixed independent forces faction. We have a lot more opportunities to use factions here, and from my own testing, it should also mean that multiplayer is a lot less restrictive on who is able to play against who. So the issue where it used to say there must be one player for each team, it was doing that because some limits seemed to be getting overflowed in how it was able to create the player IDs, which now shouldn't happen because there are 100 slots. So that is a lot more flexible. It's not necessarily all going to be used by us, but we have a lot more room to maneuver going into the future. The next change is also one of the things that we've been really hoping for a long time, and it is that we can now do story scripting for any faction we want. Before, in Empire at War, if you wanted to do story scripting, you could only do it for the Rebels, the Empire, and the Underworld. So whichever factions took the main three's position in the code. And for a lot of things, we were able to find other workarounds, like displaying text and other similar things, but what we would never been able to do is do locks and unlocks for individual units. There was no other way to kind of fake it through Lua. Now there is absolutely no distinction as far as that stuff goes between the Rebels, the Empire, the Underworld, and any other faction that we could add. This was always one of the biggest limitations on how we'd be able to work with additional factions or even existing factions that we had, and now it is not a factor anymore. We can do a lot more with these factions, and on the back end it also makes certain things a lot easier for us to work with as well, which is always nice. The last of the super high impact changes that we're going to talk about that'll be obvious in its impacts to most players, I think, is that instead of every text string having to be directly defined and then only having limited variables that you could insert into certain text strings, we're able to use arbitrary text strings wherever we want. So instead of the game displaying a missing string as missing, it'll display the content of the string, or you can just straight out put in a text string. So we can determine via a Lua script exactly what we want things to say without having to do certain things that fake text strings. So there are a lot of different possible uses for this. For example, in our galactic display, it should simplify a lot, but this has pretty big impacts. There were a few other changes and bug fixes. For example, now if you want to spawn something at a location or do something at a location, you don't need to have another object there. Like before, you'd have to find a marker. Now in Lua, you can just get a position rather than having to get an object at a position, so that's very helpful. There were also, on the bug side, fixes to things like Boba Fett's jetpack, where he shouldn't get stuck anymore, so this would apply to any other units that use the jetpack. There were some changes to how hyperspacing works in maps that are not perfectly square, so when you have the borders that aren't technically outside of the minimap, you used to be able to kind of jump into places that you shouldn't have been. This is mostly a factor in skirmish. That's been fixed. And I guess there's one other change that is actually pretty massive, is that now in Forces of Corruption, accuracy tags in units work properly. So in base Empire at War, if you had a unit with a weapon coded directly into it, it was able to use accuracy. So it wouldn't be perfectly accurate all the time. You could miss stuff with it. But in Forces of Corruption, if you had a unit that had a weapon coded directly into it, so the biggest examples of these would be like infantry in the turbo laser towers, then they wouldn't be able to miss. And now this has been fixed. In Thrawn's Revenge and Empire at War Expanded, we've had to put hard points onto a lot of stuff to make sure that they'd be able to miss, and now that is not a problem anymore. For infantry, we're probably still going to stick with hard points, but there are other things like the turbo laser towers, which we would be able to move back to having the weapons directly on the units rather than having to be a hard point. There were a few other smaller changes as well, but that's the bulk of what changed. And again, this is something that I've been really excited for a while. I wasn't able to even talk about a lot of the other devs in the team about this, but the next release of the mod is going to be changing a lot on the back end to make sure that we're able to take advantage of a lot of this, a lot of the optimization that this allows, and in the future this is really going to open up a lot of possibilities. So I want to say thank you again to all the modders who were involved in giving the feedback on this, but especially Petroglyph for making the patch and Disney for putting the patch out there and allowing Petroglyph to do this. It's pretty crazy to have a game that is now almost 15 years old get extra support like this, especially the kind of support that this is adding and the possibilities it opens for modders, and how close they work with the modders on this, and basically listen to our mess of different priorities to come to a list that, like, again, if I had to make a list of the things that I would want in a patch, this goes way beyond anything that I would have felt safe asking for. So a huge thank you to Petroglyph, and there's a lot of exciting stuff to come for Empire at War, I think. So thanks for watching. Hope to see you next time.